The struggle for control over the Ukrainian capital city of Kiev during the latter half of 1943 stands as one of the pivotal moments on the Eastern Front of the Second World War. This campaign, characterized by brutal fighting, massive casualties, and immense strategic risk, effectively determined the fate of the southern wing of the German occupation and sealed the future of Ukraine. Kiev, one of Eastern Europe's oldest cities, is believed to have been founded in the 9th century. Throughout its long history, it has witnessed a succession of conquerors, including the Khazars, the Varangians, the Mongols, and the Tatars. By 1941, it was the capital of the Soviet Ukraine. When German forces marched into the city on September 19, 1941, a devastating three-year period of Nazi terror began. The Great Battle of Encirclement that took place in the Kiev area during August and September of 1941 resulted in approximately 450,000 Soviet casualties. This initial conquest set the stage for one of the war's most horrific atrocities. The immediate consequence of the German occupation was the deployment of the SS killing squads, known as the Einsatzgruppen. Following the troops, these squads rounded up the city's Jewish population. Parts of the city had been set on fire on September 25 by troops belonging to the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, who were still hiding in the area. The Germans used these fires as a pretext for the atrocity that would make the name Babi Yar synonymous with the Holocaust. On September 29th and 30th, approximately 34,000 Jews were marched to a ravine outside the city called Babi Yar. There, they were systematically shot by men of SS Colonel Paul Blobel's Sonderkommando 4A, which was part of SS Brigadier General Otto Rausch's Einsatzgruppe C. This execution was carried out with the backing of the SD, SS police battalions, and local police. Only a small number of victims managed to escape this massacre. The military campaign to liberate Kiev in 1943 was therefore an effort specifically ordered to end this three-year reign of terror. The fight for the city and the subsequent German counterattacks became a desperate struggle for both territory and momentum, culminating in a decisive Soviet victory that confirmed the irreversible strategic decline of the German war machine in the East. The subsequent analysis explores the strategic background, the complex river crossings, the deception leading to the breakthrough, and the fierce German counteroffensives that defined this crucial turning point. The foundations of conflict and strategic shifts. The critical 1943 campaign for Kiev did not emerge in isolation. It was the direct consequence of immense recent bloodshed. Less than a month before the actions leading up to the infamous Second Battle of Kiev, both the German and Soviet armies had already suffered horrendous casualties in the great bloodletting at the Oriel salient in July of 1943. Losses of tanks and mechanized vehicles were enormous, as the German attack had been met by a powerful Soviet counterattack. The fighting left soldiers on both sides exhausted and reeling. Despite these immense strains, the Red Army was preparing to launch its first major summer offensive of the war. In Berlin, at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which was the German Armed Forces High Command, there were those who scoffed at the possibility that the Russians could mount another major offensive after the severe losses they had sustained in the July battle. However, the frontline German generals, deeply experienced in the realities of the Eastern Front, were under no such illusions about Soviet capability. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group South, foresaw the danger. He later documented that on August 2nd, his command informed the Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command, that they were expecting an immediate offensive against the northern front of Army Group South, west of Belgorod. Field Marshal von Manstein further anticipated that this attack would likely be supplemented by an assault southeast of Kharkov, intended to encircle their forces around the city and open the path for the enemy to reach the Dnieper River.
The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army successfully exploited this critical breakthrough. By the close of the first day of the offensive, the Russians had penetrated up to 24 kilometers behind the German lines. This offensive, known by the codename Rumyantsev, was named after one of the 18th century's foremost Russian generals. It was merely the first in a series of planned operations intended to pummel the German forces. In the days immediately following the initial thrust, the Soviet 53rd Army managed to cut the vital Belgorod-Kharkov road. This action created severe logistical and supply problems for the German enemy. On August 12th, the leading elements of Colonel General Ivan Stepanovich Konev's steppe front entered the outskirts of the city of Kharkov, which finally fell on August 23rd after a period of severe fighting. Simultaneously, Colonel General Fyodor Ivanovich Tulbukin's South Front assaulted General Karl Hollett's Sixth Army, which was positioned on the Muis River. Within just a few days, General Hollett's forces had been pushed back from their river defenses. By the end of August, the Soviets recaptured the city of Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. The August offensive proved extremely costly for the German forces. Army Group South sustained approximately 133,000 casualties during this period. Crucially, only 33,000 of these losses were replaced. Facing this unsustainable attrition, Field Marshal von Manstein flew to Hitler's headquarters at Rostenburg in East Prussia on September 3rd. His mission was to request either a substantial increase in replacements or permission to significantly shorten his defensive lines if the necessary replacements could not be provided. He later wrote that this high-level meeting proved to be entirely profitless. Despite the losses suffered by both sides, the Russian juggernaut continued its determined advance throughout the first half of September. Critical railway and communication lines between Army Group South and Army Group Center were severed when the Soviets broke the Bryansk-Konotop rail line. On September 4th, Hitler finally gave permission for General Erwin Janecke's 17th Army to retreat from the Kuban region to the Crimea. Further north, the Soviet 3rd Guards Army created a 45-kilometer gap between the 1st Panzer Army and the 6th Army. This massive breach was only closed on September 11th after 5 days of heavy fighting. The fall of Stalino on September 8th was followed by the capture of Mariupol on the 10th. The relentless pressure meant that the Red Army was threatening to break open the entire German southern front. The rapidly deteriorating situation forced Field Marshal von Manstein into another lengthy discussion on September 15th. Pullbacks on the right flank of Army Group Center had left General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army in a perilous, exposed position. Field Marshal von Manstein strenuously pressed the issue of an immediate withdrawal to the Dnieper River before a complete catastrophe ensued. He emphasized the gravity of the situation to Hitler, stating that the fate of the entire Eastern Front was at stake. Finally, Hitler relented to the intense pressure. He granted permission for Army Group South to withdraw to a new defensive line. This line was to run from Melitopol along the Dnieper River, extending to an area above Kiev, and then continuing along the Desna River. The first and most immediate problem facing the Soviet commanders was how to breach the combined defenses of the Dnieper and Desna rivers. These river lines were rapidly being filled with retreating German troops, forcing the Soviets to overcome fierce resistance from the German rear guards. On September 16th, General Konev's forces successfully took the city of Romny. General Hollett, in the south, pulled his 6th Army back to the Melitopol line the following day. The push toward the main river line continued unabated. September 21st saw Lieutenant General Pavel Simonovich Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army reach the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, directly opposite the town of Kaniv. General Vatutin immediately recognized the strategic importance of this location and issued urgent orders for a bridgehead to be established on the western bank of the river by any means necessary. The very next day, General Rybalko's men began crossing the river just north of Kaniv, successfully securing a crucial bridgehead in the Bukrin area. General Rybalko's position was rapidly reinforced by Lieutenant General Sergei Georgievich Trofimenko's 27th Army and Lieutenant General Kirill Semenovich Moskalenko's 70th Army. With these reinforcements, the Soviets quickly expanded the bridgehead while simultaneously fighting off persistent German counterattacks. Over the next few days, the Red Army focused on consolidating their gains and planning their subsequent movements. The Soviet High Command also attempted to utilize airborne forces to aid the bridgehead expansion. On September 26th, 2 Soviet airborne brigades were dropped into the Bukrin bridgehead. The drop occurred at night, which complicated the operation immensely. Tragically, the 3rd Brigade landed directly on top of General Otto von Knobelsdorff's 48th Panzer Corps. The resulting chaotic slaughter decimated the Soviet paratroopers. The 5th Brigade also suffered severe casualties during its own drop, rendering that unit virtually useless. Despite this terrible day for the Soviet airborne units, September 26th was not a total disaster.
Elsewhere, Lieutenant General Nikander Uevlin-Pievich Chivasov's 38th Army successfully forced a bridgehead approximately 20 kilometers north of Kiev, near Lutych. Soviet forces also established vital bridgeheads farther south in the Dnepropetrovsk area. Slowly but surely, the vaunted German Dnieper line was beginning to crack under the sustained Soviet pressure. The Germans, though stretched thin, demonstrated their continued resolve on September 27th. The Russians received another bloody nose, which was a clear indication that the Germans were still intensely focused on holding their river defenses. General von Knobelsdorff launched a fierce counterattack against the Soviet Buchan bridgehead. This attack achieved several penetrations in the Russian line and managed to surprise the Soviet commanders inside the bridgehead. Given how thinly the overall German line was stretched, a concentrated assault of this magnitude had been considered extremely unlikely by the Soviets. The assault continued over the subsequent days. Several Soviet units were completely destroyed, while many others were reduced to mere shadows of their former strength. General von Knobelsdorff came exceptionally close to clearing the entire bridgehead area. However, the stubbornness of the surviving Soviet defenders, combined with the Red Army's clear artillery superiority, helped the Soviets maintain a fragile, critical toehold on the western bank of the Dnieper. By September 30th, Army Group South had generally succeeded in withdrawing its main forces behind the Dnieper River. Geographically, the west bank of the river held a significant defensive advantage because it was considerably higher than the eastern bank. The eastern bank was a vast flat area, interwoven with swamps and streams. Looking from the west, the German defenders enjoyed unhindered, clear view of the treeless steppe that extended for several kilometers toward the Soviet lines.
The German defenses, however, were not as robust as they could have been. If Hitler had permitted the construction of defenses on the West Bank earlier in the year, the Germans would have possessed a strong, heavily fortified defensive barrier capable of meeting the Soviets head-on. Instead, many of the planned strongpoints were only half completed. These incomplete positions were manned by dangerously depleted and exhausted German units. During the arduous withdrawal to the Dnieper, Army Group South had suffered severe casualties, including more than 200,000 wounded. Despite the intense counterattacks, such as the strong assault led by General von Knobelsdorff, the average combat strength of Field Marshal von Manstein's 37 infantry divisions numbered only about 1,000 men each. This translated to a combat density of only about 50 men per kilometer of the front. Furthermore, the German armored and motorized divisions were also vastly under strength in terms of both personnel and essential equipment. The Russians had also suffered immensely during the bitter fighting withdrawal. Since August 26th, General Rokossovskii's Central Front counted 35,000 killed or missing soldiers, alongside 107,000 wounded. General Vatutin's Voronezh Front reported even heavier losses, listing 46,000 killed or missing and 131,000 wounded personnel. Although the fighting would continue unabated further south, both Soviet generals recognized that they urgently needed a temporary cessation of major offensive operations. They required breathing space to allow their men to rest and to receive necessary equipment replacements and fresh reinforcements before they could continue with the main plan to capture Kiev and destroy the German 4th Panzer Army. Despite the fact that the Germans were stretched to their absolute limit, they were still determined to launch additional counterattacks against the newly established Dnieper bridgeheads. On October 6th, Major General Arthur Hoffe's 13th Army Corps launched a determined attack against the crucial Lutnich bridgehead. This corps was supported by General Kurt von de Chevallerie's 59th Army Corps, which had been transferred from Army Group Center specifically for this mission. The attack initially made some progress, but ultimately failed when faced with superior Soviet armor. This armor had been rapidly ferried across the river to strengthen the defenses of the bridgehead. The Northern Hook and the tactical stalemate. To the north, General Rokossovskii's Central Front continued its steady push toward the city of Gomel. However, his forces were meeting increasing and determined resistance from General Walter Weiss's Second Army. Lieutenant General Pavel Ivanovich Botov's 65th Army was leading the sustained advance. Since the offensive began, General Botov's divisions had been constantly on the move, successfully forcing a crossing of the Desna River and heading northwest toward the town of Unecha, before turning southward toward Gomel. Gomel was strategically vital. Located on the west bank of the Saj River, it was arguably the most important road and railway junction on the southern half of Field Marshal Ernst Busch's Army Group Center's front.
To complete the necessary right hook of the plan to capture Kiev, it was essential that bridgeheads across the Saj River be successfully secured. Gomel itself was situated approximately 200 kilometers north of Kiev. General Rokossovskii's grand plan was to capture the city, thereby breaking the German communication lines that linked Army Group Center and Army Group South. Simultaneously, this move would establish the necessary bridgeheads from which he could launch his forces when the time was right to envelop Kiev and destroy the German 4th Panzer Army. The Germans defending this area had different ideas. The city of Gomel was defended by the troops of General Johannes Friesner's 23rd Army Corps and General Rudolf von Roman's 20th Army Corps. Both were seasoned veterans who had served extensively on the Eastern Front. They had methodically prepared their defenses. The area proved exceptionally difficult for the Soviets to take. In response, General Batov swung part of his army to the south, where he managed to secure a couple of small bridgeheads across the Saj River. On October 15th, General Batov's men discovered a critical weak point in the German Dnieper defenses in the Loyev area. Loyev was situated about 55 kilometers south of Gomel. General Batov rapidly regrouped his forces, crossed the river, and successfully established a substantial bridgehead. By pouring more reinforcements across the river, he was able to enlarge these gains, forcing the Germans to divert significant reinforcements to the area in order to keep the Soviets at bay. This new bridgehead provided the Soviets with yet another strategic dagger pointed at the vulnerable seam between Army Group Center and Army Group South, poised for the moment the general advance on Kiev would continue.
While waiting for the rest of his armies to fully reorganize for the ongoing assault across the Dnieper, General Vatutin ordered his forces within the Bukrin bridgehead to launch a renewed assault on the German forces surrounding the perimeter. On the very same day that General Batov crossed the Dnieper at Loyev, the 27th and 40th Armies, along with the 3rd Guards Tank Army, stormed the German line. Although the Germans lacked defense in depth in their wider positions, their specific defenses immediately around the bridgehead were extremely strong. Using their superior interior lines and having effective corps artillery support, the divisions of the 48th Panzer Corps held their ground. At this time, the corps was temporarily commanded by Major General Dietrich von Schultitz, who would later achieve notoriety as the Commandant of Paris in August of 1944. As the Soviets advanced out of their start lines, they suffered terrific casualties. German artillery fired directly into pre-plotted target areas with deadly effect. The Russians regrouped repeatedly to attack again, but each time they encountered the same deadly coordinated wall of fire. They launched several more attempts to break the German line over the next 3 days until the assaults were finally called off. German efforts to reclaim Kiev at the end of 1943 were ultimately thwarted by the overwhelming power of the Red Army counterattacks. Deception and the breakthrough at Lutych. Following the obvious realization by the Soviet High Command that the forces trapped inside the Bukrin bridgehead were not achieving a decisive breakthrough, tacticians in Moscow formulated a completely new plan. The established bridgehead at Lutych, situated farther north, appeared to be the most viable alternative for a major breakthrough. This Lutych bridgehead was by this time firmly consolidated and overflowing with men and necessary equipment. The area immediately surrounding the bridgehead was held by General Ernst Eberhard Hell's 7th Army Corps. Up until this point, perimeter fighting in the area had been limited primarily to clashing armed patrols. When the Soviet High Command abandoned the persistent attack stemming from Bukrin, General Vatutin was ordered to once again redeploy his available forces. This redeployment was conducted with intense secrecy. Lieutenant General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army quietly slipped out of the Bukrin bridgehead and began the long trek north toward Lutych, a distance of approximately 150 kilometers. Simultaneously, other Soviet forces remaining inside the Bukrin bridgehead continued to actively patrol the perimeter, effectively fooling the Germans into believing that all 3 Soviet armies were still firmly entrenched in the area. Speed was of the essence, although the swampy terrain separating the 2 bridgeheads made rapid movement exceptionally difficult. Lieutenant General Andrei Grigorovich Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps was designated as the first unit to execute this massive shift. His corps faced the challenge of crossing several small rivers and streams spread throughout the marshes in order to reach Lutych. To achieve this, General Kravchenko issued orders for his troops to waterproof their vehicles as thoroughly as possible. They then sped full bore across the difficult terrain. This maneuver went directly against the standard cautious rules for mechanized movement in such a treacherous environment. Although General Kravchenko lost several tanks along the arduous route, he successfully managed to get the majority of his corps through to the new objective. Other units belonging to General Rybalko's army soon followed this pioneering route. In the midst of this preparation, the Soviet High Command reorganized its southern forces. On October 29th, General Vatutin's Voronezh Front was officially redesignated as the 1st Ukrainian Front. Colonel General Konev's Steppe Front was renamed the 2nd Ukrainian Front. Their immediate neighbors to the south, the Southwest Front and the South Front, were renamed the 3rd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts respectively. To the north, General Rokossovskii's Central Front was designated the Belarusian Front. Even as these organizational changes took place, parts of Army Group South continued to be relentlessly hammered by Soviet attacks throughout the final days of October. On October 24th, Lieutenant General Pavel Alexei Rachmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army successfully took the city of Kryvyi Rog before being pushed back by General Wend von Wiedersheim's 11th Panzer Division. On the same day, General Maximilian de Angelis's 44th Army Corps was almost entirely overrun on the 6th Army's southern wing. In the 1st Panzer Army sector, Dnepropetrovsk fell to the 3rd Ukrainian Front the following day, leaving General Maximilian Freterpiko's 30th Army Corps severely depleted, a mere shell of its former strength.
During these sustained punishing attacks, Army Group South suffered catastrophic losses that the German command structure simply could not replace. For example, by June 27th, the 6th Army's 73rd Infantry Division, commanded by Brigadier General Hermann Bohme, possessed only 170 combat effectives. Major General Hermann Rocknagel's 111th Infantry Division reported only 200 combat soldiers. Equipment losses were equally severe. Across the entire 6th Army, there were only 25 operational tanks and assault guns remaining. The German forces stationed in the south suffered an additional crippling blow when Hitler categorically refused to allow General Erwin Janicki's 17th Army to evacuate the Crimea. Soviet units of the 4th Ukrainian Front capitalized on this refusal by taking the Perekop Peninsula. This critical maneuver effectively bottled up the entire 17th Army, preventing it from playing any role whatsoever in the furious, decisive battles raging to the north. Around the city of Kiev, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army was engaged in a desperate, grinding war of strike and counterstrike. As Soviet forces in the various established bridgeheads within his sector launched consistent spoiling attacks, General Hoth skillfully moved his meager reserves from one sudden crisis point to another. Only the bridgehead at Lutych remained relatively quiet. General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army was still secretly filtering into the area, and the Soviet High Command was committed to keeping all attention away from Lutych until the moment it was fully ready to launch the main, decisive attack. By November 1st, the majority of General Rybalko's units had successfully crossed the river and were in position. The fall of Kiev and the German counterthrust. With a little more necessary fine-tuning of the attack plan, General Vatutin was ready to strike the critical blow. His strategy designated the 38th Army, now commanded by General Moskalenko, as the primary spearhead. This force would utilize the 50th and 51st Rifle Corps to hit a sector held by Colonel Paul Schuerplug's 68th Infantry Division and Major General Heinrich Roth's 88th Infantry Division, immediately following a massive artillery bombardment. The 68th Division was reported to be only about 40% effective in combat, and the 88th Division was not significantly stronger. After the initial contact was successfully made, the 23rd Rifle Corps would follow. General Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps, fielding 100 tanks, was tasked with supporting the massive attack. The orders received were simple and decisive. General Secretary Stalin demanded that Kyiv be taken by November 7th, which marked the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. As dawn broke on November 3rd, the overwhelming sound of more than 2,000 Red Army artillery guns opening fire on the 7th and 13th Army Corps signaled the start of the assault. German defenses collapsed instantly under the explosive blasts as the shells tore the fortifications to pieces. Entire platoons of German soldiers simply disappeared in the relentless barrage. As the massive barrage lifted and moved forward, the 38th Army advanced rapidly, quickly overrunning the shattered German positions. Overhead, bombers and fighters belonging to General Stefan Akimovich-Krasovsky's 2nd Air Army raced across the sky, hitting German positions further to the rear and strafing anything that dared to move behind the defensive lines. The relentless Red Army troops tore a hole in the German line that the defenders were completely unable to close. Simultaneously, approximately 18 kilometers north of Lutych, General Ivan Danilovich Chernyakhovsky launched a complementary attack. He had successfully built up a bridgehead at Yasnorokodka. In conjunction with the Lutych attack, General Chernyakhovsky's 60th Army burst out of this northern bridgehead. His divisions advanced westward toward the city of Zhytomyr, easily brushing aside the fragmented German resistance they encountered in the area. In total, the combined Soviet attacks involved 337,000 men who were heavily supported by 500 tanks.
Arrayed against this massive attacking force were fewer than 150,000 German soldiers who possessed only about 50 operational tanks.
The German command had been caught completely flat-footed by the sheer scale and speed of the offensive. Upon receiving the initial urgent reports of the attack, General Hoth immediately ordered Major General Georg Jaur's 20th Panzer Grenadier Division to launch a counterattack. He also urgently called on Brigadier General Hasso Friedherr von Manteuffel's 7th Panzer Division and Colonel Werner Friebe's 8th Panzer Division to join the attack on the Russians' vulnerable northwest flank. This order was issued despite the fact that both of these German panzer divisions were vastly under strength. General von Manteuffel hit the Russian lines south of Demer, only to immediately run into concentrated and effective Soviet anti-tank fire. The Germans suffered heavy additional losses from the Red Air Force as they desperately attempted to find a way through the powerful Soviet flank. Colonel Friebe and Major General Jaur's divisions met a similar, debilitating fate and were quickly forced to switch to a defensive posture. Reeling under the sheer momentum of the Soviet assault, the Germans were forced to give way as the Russians advanced relentlessly. Major General Hauffy ordered Major General Heinrich Roth's 88th Infantry Division to begin a rapid retreat to Kiev. Major General Roth's desperate mission was to hold the city at all costs necessary. By the end of the day on November 4th, the German front surrounding Utich had completely collapsed. General Rybalko's mechanized forces were unleashed, pouring through the gaping holes that had been torn open by the 38th Army. The German withdrawal rapidly threatened to devolve into a chaotic rout as Soviet tanks roamed the battlefield, relentlessly slaughtering more of the enemy as they advanced. During the German withdrawal, they often used captured equipment. For instance, French-made Char B-1 tanks converted into Flammpanzer or flamethrower tanks were pressed into service by the Wehrmacht. On November 5th, General Moskalenko's men successfully entered the city of Kiev. They were met with fierce, block-by-block resistance. General Roth's soldiers, occupying prepared strongpoints throughout the densely built city, defended every single block. In street battles reminiscent of the brutal fighting scene in Stalingrad, the Soviets systematically destroyed one German position after another. The intense fighting raged throughout the night. Major General Roth became one of the German casualties during the battle. By the end of November 5th, the Soviets had successfully captured the main rail station. General Moskalenko announced that the majority of the city area was back in Russian hands and that the remaining enemy forces were fleeing. In reality, most of the 88th Division had been effectively destroyed during the defense of the city. On November 6th, the Soviet general sent a report confirming that the entire city had been liberated and that 6,000 German prisoners had been taken. Meanwhile, General Rybalko was driving his forces rapidly toward the city of Fastiv, also known as Fastov, located approximately 60 kilometers southwest of Kiev. His ambitious original plan was to continue the drive all the way to Vinnitsa, which was the location of Hitler's former headquarters. Had he succeeded, this move would have critically threatened the entire rear supply area of Army Group South. Fastiv itself fell to Soviet forces on November 7th. As General Rybalko continued his advance, he suddenly ran into the lead elements of Major General Adolf von Schell's 25th Panzer Division. This division had recently arrived from France, where it had originally been formed in Norway. It was severely lacking in both necessary training and modern equipment. One of its tank battalions still remained in the west, and some of its equipment included old booty that had been captured during the 1940 campaign against France. Furthermore, many of the division's experienced men had been stripped from the unit while it was in France and shipped to various other units on the Eastern Front. Some of the men who replaced them had less than a month of basic combat training. The 25th Panzer Division had arrived piecemeal, with Major General von Schell's divisional elements scattered across several different unloading areas. On the day Kiev fell, Major General von Schell was given an urgent order to advance toward Fastiv. He was completely unaware that General Rybalko's powerful forces were fast approaching his position. He quickly assembled a combat group consisting of 2 infantry battalions, 2 mixed artillery battalions, and between 10 and 15 assault guns, and began advancing toward the city. On the morning of November 7th, this combat group was surprised and hit hard by General Rybalko's spearheads. After losing a couple of armored personnel carriers in the initial engagement, the Germans were forced to retreat in the face of the numerically superior Soviet forces. While this engagement unfolded, 2 other German panzer divisions were racing to the critical scene in a desperate attempt to fill the enormous gap that had been created by the swift Russian assault.
As General von Schell's combat group battled General Rybalko's spearhead, a combat group belonging to Brigadier General Teddy Wisch's 1st SS Panzer Division, also known as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, or LAH, was brought into an area northwest of Fastiv. Their mission was to form a temporary blocking force within the large void that had opened up in the German rear. On November 10th, an armored infantry battalion from Major General Walter Kruger's 1st Panzer Division arrived in Bila Tserka with 60 armored personnel carriers. It was quickly followed by the division's armored reconnaissance battalion. They immediately began constructing blocking positions designed to slow down the advancing Soviet units operating in the area. This location was about 35 kilometers south of Fastiv and 80 kilometers southwest of Kiev. This crucial defensive move bought essential time for the XL 7th Panzer Corps, which was now commanded by General Heinrich Eberbach, to assemble sufficient forces for a concentrated counterattack.
German command response and localized battles. General Vatutin's forces continued their aggressive push westward. General Cherniakovsky's 60th Army, now aided by Lieutenant General Nikolai Pavlovich Pukov's 13th Army, heavily impacted General von der Chevalery's LIX Army Corps. This German corps was currently defending the approaches to the town of Korostin. On paper, the LIX Corps was listed as having 4 divisions. However, 3 of those divisions, the 183rd, 217th, and 339th, were severely under strength, functioning effectively at only regimental size, and were collectively designated as Corps Detachment C. This detachment was commanded by Major General August Dettling, who was the commander of the 183rd Division. In the subsequent days of intense fighting, General Dettling was replaced by Brigadier General Wolfgang Lange, the commander of the 339th Division, on November 15th. General von der Chevalery was capable of doing little more than fighting a protracted delaying action against the overwhelming strength of the 60th Army. General Hauf's 13th Corps, which was guarding the approaches to Zhytomyr, found itself in the exact same difficult predicament. General Hoth's 3 German infantry corps were now dangerously split. 2 corps were in the north, while General Hell's 7th Corps was located in the south. All 3 were in retreat. The 7th Corps, situated south of Zhytomyr, was being rapidly pushed southwest toward the left flank of the newly assembling 48th Panzer Corps. The resulting gap between the northern German corps and General Hell's corps was significant and dangerous. With virtually no organized force to stop a concerted Soviet drive, some historians later questioned why General Vatutin did not choose to head straight west. Had he done so, he could have driven his forces all the way to Berdychev instead of taking valuable time to capture Korostin and Zhytomyr. General Rybalko's armored and mechanized forces could have easily reached the area as few German units were deployed there. With the necessary infantry reinforcements to protect his exposed flanks, he could have successfully split Army Group South completely in half, making it exceedingly difficult for the German enemy to mount any kind of concentrated counterattack. Instead of exploiting this huge central gap, the 3rd Guards Tank Army had been directed farther to the southwest. General Rybalko, still harboring the original hope of reaching Vinnytsia, sent a brigade from his 9th Mechanized Corps and another brigade from his 7th Guards Tank Corps out as forward spearheads for the determined drive south. Critically overextending themselves, the 2 Soviet brigades ran directly into elements of the Leibstandarte AS Adolf Hitler Division, which were moving toward their own assembly area. On November 11th, the Soviet brigades were quickly surrounded near the villages of Popilnya and Pavolach, situated about 30 kilometers southwest of Fastiv. Only 3 days later, on November 14th, the 2 Soviet brigades were completely destroyed. However, the 55th Tank Brigade, commanded by the future Colonel General David Dragunsky, managed to successfully evacuate most of his men from the area on foot. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps successfully took the city of Zhytomyr. Farther north, General von der Chevalery's corps found itself nearly surrounded at Korostin. Supplies became so critically short that they had to be airdropped to the beleaguered corps to allow it to continue fighting. Even as this air supply effort continued, General von der Chevalery requested permission to pull back his forces in order to maintain some semblance of a combat command structure. His request was flatly denied, and Hitler issued a renewed order that the city of Korostin must be held at all costs.
Field Marshal von Manstein decided that the immediate priority in trying to halt the advancing Soviets was to relieve the intense pressure on the LIX and XII Corps. He had keenly observed that the Russians had dangerously exposed their left flank around Zhytomyr and Korostin as a direct result of General Rybalko's earlier southwest turn. On November 12th, Field Marshal von Manstein ordered a concentrated attack aimed at the rear of the Soviet 38th Army. Crucially, some elements of the designated attacking force had not yet even reached the front lines. The main assault was to be conducted by the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 1st Panzer Division, aimed at the Brusilov area, situated some 60 kilometers west of Kiev. Field Marshal von Manstein calculated that, with some luck, he could then continue the push onto Zhytomyr and Korostin and subsequently regain the vital ground that had been lost on the west bank of the Dnieper, including the city of Kiev itself. The two assault divisions were slated to be supported by the 7th Panzer Division and the 68th Infantry Division on their left flank, and by the 25th Panzer Division and the newly arriving 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich on their right flank. While the German attacking forces were preparing themselves for action, General Vatutin took proactive precautions of his own as his forces pushed westward. He too saw the same danger that Field Marshal von Manstein had noticed. In response, General Vatutin brought the 17th Rifle Corps down from the north and pulled the 21st Rifle Corps forward from the Brusilov area in order to protect his vulnerable flank. He ordered both corps to immediately plan for defensive action and further strengthen them with additional anti-tank forces. General Eberbach sent his corps into action on November 13th. General von Manteuffel headed straight toward Zhytomyr, while the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 1st Panzer Division drove toward Brusilov. With the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler on his right, General Kruger's 1st Panzer Division made good initial advances. Crossing the small Unova River, the 1st Panzer took the village of Krive on November 14th. They then advanced with elements of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler to the town of Kornin, located about 24 kilometers south of Brusilov. There the Germans encountered the arriving Russian corps that were being echeloned in depth, specifically to cover the Soviet flank. Command restructuring and the fight for Brusilov. During the extremely difficult fighting that immediately followed this initial contact, the German Panzer Division and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were stalled for a time, as was the 7th Panzer Division farther north. As the Germans regrouped their forces on November 14th, Hitler perceived the temporary slowdown as being due to inadequate command. Therefore, on November 15th, he brought in Generals Erhard Raus and Hermann Balck to take over command. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, who was then the Chief of Staff of the 48th Panzer Corps, later wrote in high praise of General Balck. He noted that General Balck was given command of the Panzer Corps, and with that appointment the Corps received one of the best Panzer commanders alive. Colonel von Mellenthin believed that if Field Marshal von Manstein was regarded as Germany's greatest strategist of the Second World War, then General Balck must also receive due recognition as the best field commander of the Wehrmacht. Colonel von Mellenthin was not as charitable in his assessment of General Raus. As Chief of Staff of the Panzer Corps, Colonel von Mellenthin had wanted to utilize all of the Corps' divisions grouped together in a powerful strike from Fastiv directly toward Kiev, rather than dividing the crucial forces. When he presented his suggested plan to the new army commander, General Raus, he was told that it was too ambitious. General Raus insisted on sticking to the original two-pronged approach. This prompted Colonel von Mellenthin to write a critical reflection. The history of armored warfare and that of cavalry warfare before that shows that the great prizes can only be won by speed, daring, and maneuver. The play-safe school of generals was all very well on the Western Front in 1914 to 1918, but is out of place in this age of the gasoline engine and the airplane. Nevertheless, the reorganized German attack rolled forward on November 15th, even as heavy rain began to fall, turning the ground into mud. With the Panther medium tank elements of the 1st Panzer Division still en route to the battle area, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler took the lead in the advance on Brusilov. At 1 hour and 5 minutes in the afternoon, the commander of the 1st SS Grenadier Regiment of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, SS Lieutenant Colonel Albert Frey, reported that his 1st Battalion had successfully entered the village of Soloviaka, located about 10 kilometers south of Brusilov. However, heavy Soviet tank and anti-tank fire immediately resulted in the destruction of several German armored vehicles, stopping the grenadiers dead in their tracks. SS Lieutenant Colonel Frey urgently ordered SS Captain Heinrich Heimann, the commander of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Assault Gun Detachment, to immediately send one of his companies to help take the village. His second company, commanded by SS Captain Emil Weissman, quickly arrived at the scene and led an infantry-supported assault with his powerful assault guns. Leading his company from the front, SS Captain Weissman personally knocked out several Soviet T-34 medium tanks and numerous anti-tank guns before he was tragically killed by a shell that struck his own gun. The force of this attack successfully compelled the Russians to abandon the village, leaving 18 burned-out T-34 tanks scattered across a field. At 1 hour and 45 minutes in the afternoon, SS Lieutenant Colonel Frey reported that Solovyka was firmly in German hands. SS Captain Weissman was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross for his decisive actions. To counter the growing German threat to Brusilov, General Vatutin ordered General Kravchenko's 5th Guards Tank Corps to move immediately into position to provide necessary support for the infantry units that were dug in near the city. The constant heavy rain made the movement of both Soviet and German units extremely difficult, as roads rapidly transformed into deep mud pits. The Soviets, however, benefited from their tanks having wider tracks, allowing them to move their tanks faster through the mud, while the narrower-tracked Germans continued to struggle forward toward their objective. Other elements of General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army, specifically the 6th and 7th Guards Tank Corps and the 9th Mechanized Corps, were also being urgently moved into the area in a massive effort to block the determined German attack. Meanwhile, General von Montefil's 7th Panzer Division, supported by Colonel Schauerplug's 68th Infantry Division, successfully reached the town of Lvov. Lvov was about 12 kilometers east of Zhytomyr. On November 16th, this action cut the crucial highway leading to Kiev. This severed the communications and supply lines between the Soviet 1st Guards Cavalry Corps and the rest of General Vatutin's front. General von Montefil then began moving northwest, intending to attack the city of Zhytomyr from a completely unexpected direction. In the critical Brusilov sector, the 1st Panzer Division received orders to disengage from its current position and move north to support the 7th Panzer Division. This left the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division to essentially continue the offensive alone. At 3 hours and 15 minutes in the morning on November 16th, SS Major Gustav Knittel's 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion successfully took Turbivka, a village situated approximately 14 kilometers south of Brusilov. Moving quickly on the rain-soaked ground, SS Major Knittel launched an immediate attack on Divin, a village located about 4 kilometers to the north. This attack ran into strong and immediate Soviet resistance, which forced SS Major Knittel to call off the initial thrust. After receiving necessary reinforcements from the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment II, SS Major Knittel renewed his attack and successfully took the village at 6 hours and 40 minutes in the evening. The attack toward Brusilov continued fiercely the following day, with constant streams of Russian reinforcements pouring into the critical area. Brigadier General Wish was ultimately forced to order the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler to switch to a defensive posture as the Soviets unleashed counterattack after counterattack. The Russians successfully broke through the German lines in several places. This included the sector around the village of Kocherovo, where SS Lieutenant Colonel Frey's 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment found itself completely surrounded by Soviet forces. The regiment immediately assumed an all-around defense and managed to successfully repulse a total of 8 separate tank-supported attacks of regimental size or greater before darkness finally fell. During this intense, localized fighting, SS Corporal Alfred Schneiderheit distinguished himself through exceptional bravery. Serving as an anti-tank rifle troop leader, SS Corporal Schneiderheit and his platoon successfully held off several powerful Soviet infantry attacks throughout the night. The following morning, the Soviets attacked again, this time with heavy tank support. SS Corporal Schneiderheit allowed the enemy tanks to advance to within 60 meters of his position before opening fire and successfully destroying one of them. The returning Russian fire forced SS Corporal Schneiderheit and his men to pull back, and the corporal was wounded in the process.
Since his company commander had also been wounded in the fighting, SS Corporal Schneiderheit took the initiative and launched a counterattack using the remnants of his platoon. Grabbing a machine pistol, he led his men forward and successfully regained the lost position. This decisive action allowed his 8th Company to regain contact with its neighboring company. He and his men then went on to repulse 2 more tank-supported attacks. With every officer and sergeant in the company either dead or wounded, SS Corporal Schneiderheit took complete command of the company and attacked the enemy flank. During the attack, he was hit by a shell fragment that nearly severed his middle finger from his left hand. After a field dressing was quickly applied, SS Corporal Schneiderheit continued to lead his men well into the night until he finally passed out from sheer loss of blood. His heroic actions successfully halted the Soviet drive in that sector and earned him a recommendation for the prestigious Knight's Cross, which he personally received from Hitler on January 16, 1944. Recapturing Zhytomyr and the defense of the Bulge. While the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was stuck in front of a highly defended Brusilov, the overall situation at Zhytomyr was far more promising for the German forces. The addition of the 1st Panzer Division had given the Germans the necessary punch they needed to successfully take on the Soviet 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, which was supported by a rifle corps from the 60th Army. On the night of November 18th, an attack spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Adalbert Schultz' 25th Panzer Regiment, which was part of the 7th Panzer Division, successfully broke into the city. Armored infantry was quickly brought forward to consolidate the breakthrough. During the morning of November 19th, a sharp and intense battle took place beneath the city's ancient onion-dome churches and centuries-old buildings. The Soviets were finally pushed out of the urban area by mid-afternoon, leaving the city once again firmly in German hands. Guarding the flank of the main attack, other elements of the 1st Panzer Division reported that they had destroyed more than 20 Soviet tanks that were attempting to reinforce the city's beleaguered defenders. The fall of Zhytomyr altered the tactical situation for both sides involved. Like master chess players, General Vatutin and General Raus began planning their next critical moves, each hoping to catch their opponent making a mistake. In the Brusilov sector, the 25th Panzer Division moved up to reinforce the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Also arriving to the front was Brigadier General Hans Kellner's well-seasoned 19th Panzer Division. With these new arrivals, General Raus ordered General Balck to use the 1st Panzer, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, and the 68th Infantry Division to maintain pressure on the Soviets, pushing them eastward toward Brusilov. A combat group from the 2nd SS Panzer Division was also moved into the area and attached to the 7th Panzer Division. While these German moves were actively in progress, the Soviet High Command ordered the 74th, 94th, and 107th Rifle Corps of the 1st Guards Army to move by rail toward Kiev. Their objective was to occupy a pre-planned defensive line located behind the 38th Army. Colonel General Vasily Ivanovich Kuznets, the commander of the 1st Guards Army, was given explicit orders to strictly avoid contact with the German forces unless the dire situation absolutely warranted it. As German forces slogged through the heavy mud, throwing themselves relentlessly against the 38th Army's defensive positions, General Kuznets received permission to send the 94th Rifle Corps forward to bolster the weakening line. For the time being, the primary Soviet forces were ordered onto the defensive, allowing the Germans to batter away against their prepared positions.
With the 1st and 7th Panzer Divisions pressing hard from the west, General Balck ordered the Brusilov attack to continue with renewed vigor. Early on November 20th, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler moved through a sea of thick mud from Vodoti toward Brusilov. Although some units achieved initial success in overrunning several Soviet forward positions, the main attack halted at 5 hours and 45 minutes in the morning. The halt was attributed to heavy artillery fire, local counterattacks launched by Soviet tanks, and the horrendous, unrelenting ground conditions. The German detachment operating near Zhytomyr was now moving within range of the Brusilov positions. General Balck issued new orders to his corps. With the 7th Panzer Division and the 68th Infantry Division guarding the northern flank, the 1st Panzer Division was tasked with breaching the enemy lines located east of Kolcherovo and then turning sharply south to attack Brusilov from the northeast. General Kellner's 19th Panzer Division was charged with the task of taking Homutets, a village located about 6.5 kilometers southeast of Brusilov, while the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was ordered to continue its attack from the south. While the Germans regrouped and prepared for this new multi-pronged attack, the Soviets were far from idle. General Vatutin moved the battered 1st Guards Cavalry Corps and the 5th and 8th Guards Tank Corps into new defensive positions surrounding Brusilov. The Russians also maintained heavy artillery harassing fire throughout the entire area. During one such concentrated barrage on November 30th, the commander of SS Panzer Regiment I, SS Lieutenant Colonel George Schoenberger, was killed when his command post suffered several direct hits.
He was immediately replaced by SS Major Joachim Peiper, who would later be tried for the infamous Malmedy massacre that occurred during the 1944 Ardennes offensive. The coordinated German attack continued on November 21st. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division moved forward at 7 hours and 45 minutes in the morning. After achieving some brief initial success, the SS troops ran into heavy and determined enemy resistance. By noon, the entire attack had completely stalled. General Kruger's 1st Panzer Division also immediately ran into serious problems when it hit a strong anti-tank line that the Soviets had dug in deep inside a forest. After losing several Panzer IV tanks, the division's heavier Panther tanks rolled into position and began shelling the enemy line. The Soviets effectively countered this move by urgently calling in several Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik ground assault aircraft. The pilots of these aircraft seemed impervious to the rain-laden skies. In the face of such combined opposition, General Kruger was forced to call off his attack. The 19th Panzer Division suffered a very similar fate. For the subsequent 2 days, the German forces threw themselves repeatedly at the entrenched Soviet positions, desperately hoping to find a crack or weakness in the defensive line. The 1st and 19th Panzer Divisions finally managed to make some significant headway and successfully executed a pincer movement that effectively encircled 2 Soviet rifle divisions and elements of a tank corps that were positioned inside Brusilov. Meanwhile, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division launched a renewed push from the south, overcoming heavy resistance and destroying several Soviet tanks. Although most of the defending Soviet troops were able to escape the collapsing pocket, Brusilov finally fell to the Germans on November 24th. Although the Germans successfully claimed a tactical victory with the capture of Brusilov, they could advance no farther. The unrelenting days of heavy rain had transformed the terrain, making further offensive operations entirely impossible for the time being. Their vehicles required extensive overhauling, and the troops were completely exhausted. On November 26th, General Balck received specific orders to temporarily suspend his attack and immediately form defensive positions. The German assault in the Brusilov sector had reached its unavoidable end, but plans for a new, sustained offensive were already being developed.
Planning the December offensive and the Malini Pocket. General Rauss remained highly concerned about the Soviet forces positioned northeast of Zhytomyr. Specifically, General Chernyakhovsky's 60th Army had taken up new positions that directly threatened General Balck's forces if the decision was made to continue the attempts to retake Kiev. General Rauss issued orders for the 48th Panzer Corps to once again regroup in preparation for a new assault against what had evolved into an inward bulge in General Balck's northern flank. The Brusilov sector itself would be occupied by newly arriving reinforcements, as the ground conditions remained so poor that neither side could effectively conduct major offensive operations there. A significant operational challenge for the Germans lay in their poor intelligence. German intelligence concerning Soviet dispositions in the salient west and south of Kiev was totally inadequate. Intelligence had completely failed to notice the strategic arrival of the 1st Guards Army. Furthermore, it also failed to notice that Colonel General Konstantin Nikolaevich Lysilidze's 18th Army was moving into the general area. Although the 1st Guards Army and the 18th Army were under the direct control of the Soviet High Command, their unexpected presence would soon provide General Vatutin with a strong force base for both defensive and offensive operations in the immediate future. The offensive plan meticulously worked out by Field Marshal von Manstein and General Rauss had 2 distinct objectives. General von der Chevallerie's LIX Corps remained dangerously isolated at Kerestin, although the German Luftwaffe was managing to drop some essential supplies to the beleaguered troops. An attack launched against General Chernyakhovsky's flank would force the Soviets to divert men and material away from the Kerestin sector in order to counter the new German assault. If the attack against the Soviet bulge proved successful, it would also permit General Haus's 13th Corps to link up with the LIX Corps and re-establish a continuous, stable German front in the entire area. Throughout the last days of November and the first days of December, the German units slowly made their way toward the assembly areas surrounding Zhytomyr. Once there, the units dedicated the days before the scheduled attack to improving their combat readiness and thoroughly scouting the best possible avenues of advance. After several continuous weeks of heavy combat, most of the German units were severely understrength and few replacements were forthcoming.
For example, on November 30th, the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler's 1st SS Panzergrenadier Regiment had a combat strength of only 795 officers and men. The 2nd SS Panzergrenadier Regiment reported a strength of 747. Curiously, the only unit that had been brought up to its full authorized strength was General von Manteuffel's 7th Panzer Division. Reconnaissance of the enemy's primary defensive position was almost nil due to the inherent weakness of the German infantry forces present. The consistently bad weather conditions prevented effective aerial reconnaissance. Furthermore, the Germans were reluctant to send many ground patrols forward, even when they could, because they feared the Soviets might be tipped off about the coming major attack. Consequently, General Balk's troops were virtually in the dark concerning what awaited them on the enemy side of the battlefield when the assault began. During the night of December 5th, the German units rolled slowly toward their jump-off points. General Balk planned to attack General Chernyakhovski's right flank, which was defended by the 30th and 15th Rifle Corps. The 1st Panzer Division was slated to hit the Soviets just north of Zhytomyr, with the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler positioned on its right. Colonel Scherpflug's 68th Infantry Division was also set to advance on the extreme right flank of the Corps. While General Balk attacked in the north, the 13th and 24th Panzer Corps would simultaneously pin down the Soviet forces defending the Radomyshl sector. General von Manteuffel's 7th Panzer Division was General Balk's designated ace in the hole. Its critical mission was to advance far to the left of the 1st Panzer Division, penetrating deep into the rear of the 60th Army. The goal was to cause a complete and rapid collapse of the enemy defenses. The difficult terrain and the lack of suitably heavy bridges in the area prevented General von Manteuffel from utilizing his Tiger tank detachment. Instead, the Tiger detachment was attached to the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, which possessed an easier avenue of advance.
On the Soviet side, General Vatutin was equally busy during the period it took the Germans to fully assemble their forces. The Soviet High Command agreed to General Vatutin's request to have the 74th and 107th Rifle Corps move forward and occupy defensive positions between Brusilov and Kiev. Colonel General Leselieze's 18th Army, which included 3 rifle corps, was also ordered into defensive positions. Since the Brusilov front remained largely stagnant, General Rybalko received orders to withdraw 2 corps from his 3rd Guards Tank Army and send them to new positions located west of Kiev. In addition, advance units of Colonel General Mikhail Yefimovich Katukov's 1st Tank Army were beginning to enter the critical area. The December push and the failure of encirclement. At 6 hours in the morning on December 6th, the German panzers began rolling forward. The weather had turned significantly colder, and a light frost had made the ground slightly more passable for the tanks as they moved out. Soviet outposts were caught completely by surprise. As the panzers rapidly approached, the Germans successfully intercepted several radio messages calling for urgent help. These desperate pleas were often met with deep skepticism and accusations of vastly overestimated enemy strength. One blunt reply intercepted by the Germans stated simply, "Your message is unbelievable." The 7th Panzer Division made surprisingly good progress during the initial stages of the attack. Although the Soviets put up spirited resistance in several localized areas, the overall defense was clearly uncoordinated. Slicing straight through the Soviet line, General von Manteuffel successfully turned northwest for his planned end run behind the Russian line. He was significantly aided by aircraft from the German 8th Air Corps. Its commander, Major General Hans Seidemann, had established his headquarters close to the 48th Panzer Corps headquarters. Furthermore, his air liaisons were operating with the spearhead of the attack, coordinating precise airstrikes to assist the advancing panzers. The Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler also moved swiftly, successfully capturing the village of Stirti after a sharp fight. It then continued its advance, taking Korchava and Bejiv before noon. During the afternoon, elements of the division set out east toward Mokrenchina and Chernihin. Darkness fell as the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler was still moving determinedly toward those 2 strategic objectives. General Kruger's 1st Panzer Division became embroiled in intense street fighting in a small town located about 30 kilometers northwest of Radomyshl. It was not until late afternoon that the town was finally cleared of Soviet defenders. Meanwhile, Brigadier General Hans Piekenbrock's 208th Infantry Division, which had been attached to General Balk's corps, moved into the area southeast of Chernihin. Simultaneously, General Hauf's 13th Corps attacked Soviet positions south of Radomyshl at Slipsytsi and Golovin.
The German advance continued with even more success the following day. General von Manteuffel caught the 60th Army's headquarters completely flat-footed. Several Soviet staff officers were lost as the headquarters rapidly scattered in disarray. General von Manteuffel's objectives were the Russian bridgeheads located in the Malin area. German intelligence mistakenly believed these were occupied by only a few Soviet divisions. In reality, there were 3 full Soviet corps entrenched in the area. Along with the 1st Panzer Division and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Germans were effectively squeezing General Chernyakhovsky's forces into an ever-shrinking area along the south bank of the Irsha River. General Balck had originally hoped to coordinate a concentrated attack on the Malin bridgeheads using at least 3 panzer divisions. General von Manteuffel found himself engaged in a tough, isolated battle at Nyenkiva, located 12 kilometers southwest of Malin, as he patiently awaited the arrival of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. At 2 hours and 30 minutes in the afternoon, Combat Group Paper of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler successfully captured the rail line located west of Torchin, about 40 kilometers southwest of Malin. Major Paper then continued his advance, wiping out scattered pockets of Soviet resistance as he moved northeast. However, he was eventually forced to call a halt to the thrust due to a critical lack of fuel, which would not arrive until the following morning. The 1st Panzer Division continued its aggressive drive northwest, with its eyes firmly set on the Teterev River. Hooking around Radomyshl, the 1st Panzer Division took the village of Horbulev. A combat group commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Joachim Brodel then headed toward Detinets and Mircha. Lieutenant Colonel Brodel found Detinets defended by highly determined Soviet forces. After heavy and sustained fighting, he reported 21 Russian tanks, 3 artillery pieces, and 20 anti-tank guns destroyed.
On December 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Brodel set out for the village of Fedorivka, which was also found to be heavily defended. The village was only taken after savage house-to-house fighting. After successfully refueling, Lieutenant Colonel Brodel continued his relentless march. His advance finally ended on December 11th, when the 1st Panzer Division reached the Teterev River west of the village of Malaracha, just north of Radomyshl. Since the beginning of his successful counterattack, General Balck had forced the Russians to retreat steadily back toward Kiev in several critical sectors. Although the Radomyshl defenses still held firm, the Soviet forces positioned north of the city had been forced to retreat across the Teterev River. This move endangered not only the 60th Army, but also exposed the flank of the 38th Army. Farther north, the 7th Panzer Division and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were relentlessly hammering away at the Soviet bridgeheads in the Malin sector. Meanwhile, the 13th Corps continued to chip away at the Radomyshl defenses from the south. Despite the strong enemy resistance, the German counterattack seemed to be largely proceeding as planned by the German High Command. While the Russian forces struggled desperately to hold their ground in the bulge west of Kiev, the Soviet High Command continued to flow large numbers of new units into the critical area. The 25th Tank and 4th Guards Tank Corps, each possessing more than 200 tanks and self-propelled guns, were quickly funneled into the Kherson and Malin sectors. The 18th Army's 11th Rifle Corps was also sent forward to establish a defensive line along the eastern bank of the Teterev River. This was intended to bolster elements of the 15th and 23rd Rifle Corps that were currently retreating across the river. Forward elements of the 27th and 40th Armies also arrived in the Kiev area, notably without being detected by German intelligence. In order for the Germans to continue their major counterattack successfully, they first had to eliminate the various Soviet bridgeheads that dotted the Teterev and Irsha rivers. Colonel von Mellenthin reported that one such major bridgehead was successfully destroyed by the combined forces of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 1st Panzer Division. This action resulted in the reported elimination of 3.5 Russian divisions. At Malin, the 7th Panzer Division was also highly successful in destroying several bridgeheads after a period of heavy fighting. As German infantry divisions moved into their prepared positions on the west bank of the Teterev, the panzer units operating there were pulled out of the line for a crucial day of rest and maintenance. They were then turned north to help General von Manteuffel out on the Irsha line. German forces had successfully recaptured Kherson and were now actively pushing the Soviets eastward. With the Russians focused entirely on the attacking forces directly in front of them, General Balck perceived an opportunity for a decisive enveloping attack that
that could inflict even more catastrophic damage on the enemy. His plan utilized the 7th Panzer Division as his right hook and the 1st Panzer Division and the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler as his left. General von Manteuffel received orders to cross the Irsche River east of Malin and establish a secure bridgehead. This bridgehead would serve as the essential jump-off point for the critical maneuver. With the bridgehead secured, General von Manteuffel waited for the other two powerful divisions to arrive and link up. Under the cover of a heavy and sustained artillery bombardment, the three divisions began their decisive attack on December 19th. While General von Manteuffel swung northwest behind the Soviet line, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 1st Panzer Division launched a frontal assault on the Russian positions surrounding the village of Mileni, which was about 30 kilometers to the west. As the 7th Panzer Division turned decisively west, the other two powerful divisions fought their way through heavy Soviet defenses and continued moving north of the Irsche River. This crucial move succeeded in cutting off up to 2 full Soviet divisions that were currently facing the Germans advancing from Kerestin. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 1st Panzer Division then swung northeast. Their objective was to link up with General von Manteuffel, which would successfully create a large pocket around Mileni. The trapped Soviet forces inside this pocket could then be systematically destroyed by the advancing German infantry. During the fighting around Kiev, Soviet sappers were continuously working to establish crossings of the Dnieper River, often under the threat of approaching aircraft. On December 20th, the plan seemed to be proceeding perfectly on schedule for the Germans, as the Russians were again caught off guard by the swift maneuver. However, the fatal flaw in the operation was that German intelligence had absolutely no idea about the true extent of the forces General Balck was facing. It was known that the Soviets had concentrated forces around Mileni, but it was only after a critical map was found on a dead Russian major that the Germans finally realized the true scale of those forces. The map revealed that they were going up against at least 3 Soviet tank corps and 4 infantry corps. Moreover, the Russians were continuing to pour even more troops into the area. A report issued by the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler succinctly stated the German predicament. There is a constant reinforcement for the enemy from the east. The fact that we are being outflanked on both sides makes it impossible to hold on to our decision to make a forward thrust on both sides of the march line.
The Germans continued to struggle to close the intended Mileni pocket up until December 23rd. On that day, General Balck issued immediate orders to stabilize the line and suspend all attacks in the area. During the afternoon and evening, the exhausted panzer divisions pulled back their forces and established firm defensive positions. The strategic conclusion and lasting implications. While German attention and resources were heavily focused on the counter-thrust toward Kiev and the Mileni operation, the Russians had also poured significant additional reinforcements into the vulnerable Brusilov sector. On December 24th, 3 combined Soviet armies, 2 tank armies, and a number of independent corps suddenly burst out of their positions. They struck the 3 weakened German panzer divisions, the 8th, 19th, and 25th, that were currently facing them. The Soviets crashed through the thin German positions, immediately creating wide, unclosable gaps in the defensive line. With the powerful beginning of this December 24th offensive, the determined German attempt to retake the vital city of Kiev was finally and irrevocably at an end. The Soviet forces had firmly and permanently established themselves on the west bank of the Dnieper River. This outcome was exactly what Hitler had desperately wanted to avoid at all costs. Although fighting would continue for several more months to clear all German forces from the lower Dnieper region, the outcome was inevitable. The costly fighting around Kiev had so severely depleted the units of Army Group South that they could no longer sustain the defense. The Battle of Kiev in 1943 was a decisive strategic turning point. It confirmed the permanent shift in military dominance on the Eastern Front, demonstrating the Red Army's capacity not just to absorb massive casualties, but to launch successful, continuous summer and winter offensives, shattering the German initiative. The immediate results were devastating for the German war effort. The entire southern front of Army Group South had been irrevocably weakened. The Soviet High Command strategy had succeeded in isolating the 17th Army in the Crimea and securing numerous essential bridgeheads across the mighty Dnieper. These bridgeheads, particularly the one at Lutych, provided the Red Army with a secure, massive platform for launching future offensives deep into Ukraine and beyond. The battle highlighted significant failings in the German command structure, particularly the rigid, strategic mistakes made at the highest levels.
Field Marshal von Manstein's urgent requests for replacements or permission to shorten the lines were initially refused by Hitler, leading directly to the crippling depletion of Army Group South. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs, such as the initial refusal to allow withdrawal to the Dnieper line and the later denial of evacuation for the 17th Army in the Crimea, guaranteed the destruction and isolation of critical forces. The rapid replacement of commanders, such as the introduction of Generals Ross and Balk, although intended to invigorate the command, often resulted in tactical hesitation and friction, as noted by Colonel von Manlenten's criticism of General Raus's play-safe approach. Conversely, the Soviet High Command demonstrated improved operational flexibility and deception. The secret, rapid, and unconventional redeployment of General Ryabulko's 3rd Guards Tank Army from the failed Bukrin bridgehead to the successful Utik bridgehead was a masterstroke of tactical deception. This move completely surprised the German command and ensured the success of the main breakthrough on November 3rd. The Soviets also mastered the art of continuous reinforcement, effectively flowing fresh troops and materiel into threatened areas, even as they suffered immense casualties. The arrival of the 1st Guards Army and the 18th Army, undetected by German intelligence, demonstrated the deep reserves available to the Soviet command and their growing ability to achieve tactical surprise.
The human cost was staggering on both sides. General Rokossovskii's Central Front alone suffered over 140,000 casualties between August and October, while General Vatutin's Voronezh Front suffered nearly 180,000 casualties during this same period. Yet the German losses were strategically irreparable. The infantry divisions were reduced to fractions of their authorized strength, and the armored units, like the 6th Army with only 25 operational tanks, were crippled. These manpower and equipment losses meant the German defense could only delay, not defeat, the inevitable Soviet push. The ultimate conclusion of the Second Battle of Kiev was monumental. The city, which had endured 3 brutal years of Nazi occupation, including the unimaginable horror of the Babi Yar massacre, was finally and permanently liberated. The German dream of permanently holding on to the strategic wealth of Ukraine was extinguished. The cost was extreme, paid for in the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The successful Soviet campaign secured their position as the dominant force in the East. Although the complete liberation of Ukraine would require several more months of fighting, the fate of the capital city had been sealed. Kiev would never again fall under German control, marking a definitive end to the Nazi reign of terror in that vital region of the Eastern Front. The battle stands as a powerful testament to the massive scale of mobilization, the strategic maneuvering, and the brutal determination required to repel the Nazi regime and ultimately push toward final victory.